Good Sunday evening, everybody. Pastor James here. Hope you're having a great evening and a great Lord's Day. Hey, we're talking on these Sunday nights about how to minister effectively to different generational groups that are not only in our church, but also in our community around us. I don't know if you heard the news this past week, but the company Zillow released some information that told us that the majority of people in the nation who are moving right now are moving to Texas. Texas is growing exponentially, and we need to be prepared for that as a church family. That means that different generational groups, a diverse amount of generational groups and cultures are moving in droves to the Lone Star State. And while we rejoice in that, we have to be ready as a church family to minister, especially here in the Austin area that is experiencing quite a lot of growth. And so we want to be aware of how we can minister effectively across generations to become a multi-generational congregation that is alert to how different congregations or different generations tick, and how we can minister effectively and also make the gospel understandable to each and every generational group. In fact, for our guidebook for this journey, we're using this book right here. It's called Effective Generational Ministry, and I'd encourage you to pick a copy of one of these books up. You can find it at Amazon.com, maybe Christianbook.com. But it's a good resource if you want to follow along in this Sunday evening study that we're doing. All right, let's start tonight with a little bit of review, just so we can be on the same page. This is what we talked about last week, and we're just going to review this very, very quickly. And then tonight, we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about the traits of the baby boomer generation and how we can minister effectively to that generation. All right, so a little bit of review first. First of all, this study is an examination of different generations as distinctive cultures. In other words, we don't want this discussion or this study to devolve in such a way that we begin to overly criticize one group or one generational group as inferior to another generational group. Sometimes we do that in church, unfortunately. We say, well, I just can't stand those boomers. They don't understand anything. Or a group of older folks or Gen Xers like myself look at millennials or Gen Zers and we say, well, they just don't know how to function in the world today. And so we can become overly critical. Part of the reason we do that, part of the critical approach that we take, oftentimes is due to the fact that we don't examine and understand different generations as distinctive cultural groups. Now, what does that mean, though? Well, a culture is defined as the total process of human activity in a given area. In other words, different generations that we see today, not only moving into our community, but also into our church, have different language. We may speak English, but we have different types of words that we use, don't we? We also have different habits, beliefs, something called confirmation bias, which is the way that we filter information that we hear, and also something called plausibility structures. That's just a fancy term that means that different cultures define what is acceptable or unacceptable behavior. And so sometimes when another group, another generation has a different structure, the way that they process information, we can feel like they don't get us, they don't understand, or they're against us, and that can cause some consternation. So if we want to eliminate that kind of consternation, we need to understand that different generations are really distinctive cultural groups. And if we begin to approach the situation from that perspective, that this is a different culture of people that I need to understand and that I need to understand how to make the gospel understandable to them, that will go a long way in helping us in ministry. Now, the different generations that we're going to look at in this study are the baby boomers born between 46 and 1964. We'll look more at them in specific terms in just a moment. We're also going to be talking about the Generation X, which is my generation. I was born in this group. They are people born between 1965 and 1981. Then the millennial generation is 1982 to 2001. And Gen Z, we're going to talk a little bit about them in this study as well. The Gen Z generation born between 2001 and really the present day. All right, so we're going to look at the traits of these generations. We're going to look at what makes them tick as distinctive cultures, not as cultures to be deconstructed in order to fit our goals and our narratives. But no, we're going to look at these cultures and understand what makes them tick, and then we're going to talk about different ministry goals and how we can effectively minister to one another. All right. So what are the traits of the baby boomers? Let's talk about this group. Here are their traits. First of all, this is a large group of people. Approximately 83 million Americans, according to our Effective Generational Ministry guidebook that we're using, are baby boomers, 83 million. So this is a large group. In fact, the only other generation that is alive today that competes with this number is the millennial generation. But baby boomers are still 83 million people strong. Now, one very specific trait, and we won't go through all of these, I just want to highlight a couple of them here, but one that is particularly important is the way that national events defined this group. These were actual lived events. Whereas for me as a Gen Xer, or as my millennial brothers and sisters could attest, we just hear about these things, these events. We just read about them in history and hear about them in history classes. Our parents and grandparents lived this out, all right, defining experiences. John F. Kennedy's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, Malcolm X's assassination, the Civil Rights Movement, Watergate, Roe versus Wade. These were events that still have magnificent ripple effects on our culture and society today. Our baby boomers lived that out. Now how that comes into play to ministry, we'll learn about that in just a few moments. But baby boomers, you can really help us, younger generations, to understand with greater clarity what these events truly mean for our lives even today. Another thing that I want to highlight here is massive technological growth that happened during the baby boomer, the golden age, the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and really even till today. In fact, if you think about it, baby boomers started with black and white televisions. In fact, my parents didn't get TVs until the late 50s, their families, and it was black and white televisions. They've gone from black and white TV all the way to streaming Netflix and satellite and internet and the whole nine yards, landing a rover on Mars. That's where we've come from. All right, so the baby boomer generation has experienced a lot of technological growth, and that can be really helpful for us as Gen Xers and millennials. Also, I want to highlight something else on this list here, and that is an idealized work ethic. In other words, baby boomers have taken very seriously their employment, their jobs, their vocations. In fact, so seriously that many baby boomers, even though they officially retire, they're not really in retirement. They're working at a second career or doing something that is very much different than what they did as a vocational career in their working years, but are now still earning money in different creative ways. A large percentage of baby boomers have a strong work ethic, and so much so that they're not really retiring. And in fact, that has led to some criticism of other generations that they don't work hard enough or that they don't have a strong work ethic. And it's also led to some criticisms of boomers from the other side, from Gen Xers and millennials, saying, listen, they're not retiring, they're not giving up anything. And so how are we going to have positions of leadership if the baby boomers just keep working and holding us down? All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that also in just a minute. Also, one other thing before we go to the next slide is that baby boomers have tended to be what we would call nationalistic and materialistic. Now, this is a criticism. It's not meant to be deconstructive or to say you all are horrible and Gen Xers are the perfect ones. No, there just has been a tendency towards materialism. Along with a strong work ethic, there's been a tendency to say, hey, let's fill our barns as big as we can. But also this nationalistic component that has sort of equated what we've called the American dream with the kingdom of God, saying that, America is God's chosen nation and God favors us over different people. That line of thinking really doesn't resonate that much anymore with especially millennials, Gen Xers to a certain degree. But we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for ministry here in just a moment. Now, we could also ask, what specifically is it about church and religion that is trademarks or are trademarks of the baby boomer generation? Well, we see among baby boomers, in America especially, that denominational affiliation is still rather important. Are you a Baptist? Are you a Methodist? Do you know what that means? While at the same time, we've seen in subsequent generations, especially Gen Xers, the rise in non-denominational affiliation or churches that take their denominational affiliation out of their name. Sometimes we see baby boomers become very confused by this. They look to pastoral leadership and say, well, why are people rejecting what it means to be a Baptist or a Methodist or Catholic or Church of Christ and Presbyterian and those kind of things and opting for a non-denominational approach? We've also seen during the baby boomer generation that there has been significant infighting that has taken place in denominational structures. You had, in fact, in the late 70s, among Baptists, Southern Baptists, a tremendous rift that developed that still really continues today. And my generation has really been charged with picking up the pieces of that. And there has been a real emphasis on non-denominational frameworks for doing church because of some of the rifts in denominations over the past 30, 40, 50 years. Also, we see when it comes to religion or faith or church, that traditional values among baby boomers is very important. You'll hear that terminology. That's one of the language habits of this particular generational culture, is to talk about what is traditional values. And by that, we assume that means that baby boomers are very particular in wanting and desiring the values and the traits and the traditional habits, church and religious habits that were sort of grilled into them during their childhood and youth to be prominent today as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But also, we've seen a tendency among baby boomers, and this is filtered down into Generation Xers and also millennials, that church is a rather compartmentalized thing. In other words, you have your home, your family, but that's sort of separated from church life. When now, especially among millennials, there's kind of a tendency now to say, Well, isn't home and family and faith all connected? And so again, we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But these are the traits of the baby boomer generation. Now, here are some admonitions then, some ways to look biblically for baby boomers and how to become more effective at ministry, and also how we as Gen Xers and millennials can relate better to baby boomers. We would suggest, first of all, that baby boomers be more alert to heavy-handed or autocratic leadership. In other words, this kind of hierarchical model we would suggest is maybe not the best to put into a church system. In fact, Jesus' way of ministry was not really autocratic. It was not hierarchical. He was absolutely in charge, but he called people to walk alongside him. We see this also in the ministry of Paul, that he put specific leaders in place in different churches, but they absolutely cooperated. There was not sort of this heavy-handed top-down, everything's about meetings and micromanagement. It wasn't an American business model that was put on the church. And so we would encourage in this study that baby boomers reassess sort of the leadership styles that we see in churches. Is it biblical or not? Also, baby boomers can be very, very effective at helping us Gen Xers and millennials to assess the good and the bad of technology and technological resources and technological improvements. In other words, this is the generation that's gone from black and white television all the way to Netflix and putting satellites in orbit and putting rovers on Mars, right? Technological improvements. So how can we as churches, as Gen Xers, as millennials, understand better what technological progress is all about? What's the good? What's the bad? What's the ugly? What do we need to leave in and what do we need to leave out? Baby boomers can really help other generations at that point. Also, some generations have a tendency to focus on the good old days, back when everything was just great. There's a tendency in each generation to do that, but baby boomers can really help us to focus on the future. In other words, in the Bible, we don't really see this reflection all that much on the past or trying to get to the past. We're focused more on where is God leading? What is God doing? Baby boomers can help millennials and Gen Xers a great deal at saying, hey, the past was good, but listen, here we are today. This is the reality now. Here's how we can move forward. The baby boomer generation has seen so much change that they can help other generations understand how to effectively change with the times. We've talked a little bit about churches based on business models. They're not necessarily more successful or effective. And so this is one aspect of life, of church life and community life, that Generation Xers and millennials can relate better to baby boomers here and say, hey, there may be a different way and a more effective way to do leadership and to do ministry in the church that's not so autocratic or not so much machinery that's involved in it. Baby boomers also next can help others understand that the institutional church still has great value. In other words, it's still okay to be a Baptist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian. These denominations are not to be at each other's throats. They're just different ways of looking at Christianity. And so instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, we're just going to reject all denominations, we're going to reject all of these distinctives that have made us strong denominationally, but also in the diverse Christian life of America, we're going to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So baby boomers can help us understand that the church, as Jesus founded it, is still of great worth. The church should not be rejected. Is the church perfect? Absolutely not. We shouldn't expect the church to be perfect. We are imperfect people. However, that does not mean that we should reject all institutions, period. Baby boomers can really help us with that. Also, because baby boomers lived out the civil rights movement, they can help us as Gen Xers and millennials to shape our concern for racial and gender equality in the church. How should we do that? You all lived it out. You were there in real time. Give us some input on how we can do a better job with that. In fact, that leads to our next item here: mentor others away from a consumeristic church mindset. In other words, just because a church has maybe mediocre music and mediocre preaching, that doesn't mean that you should just reject that church and go to some that has all the glitz and glamour. How can you fit in the local context, in the local church that you're in, and make a difference? You know, a lot of times we look at church these days kind of like going to the grocery store. You know, I'm going to go pick up my Bible study over here, and I'm going to go get my good preaching on this all over here and my music over here. And if they don't like what I have, then I'm just going to go to the next grocery store down the street. That's not the way churches should operate. We're all in this together. And so how can we invest in this local church family right where we are? So helping people from a mentorship point of view as well. And then differentiating between the kingdom of God and the world's kingdoms. And in fact, we get in trouble when we say, well, America is equal to the kingdom of God, or this is the real promised land that was promised in, Genesis and Exodus. We can get into on really thin ice doing things like that. And so it's incumbent upon baby boomers and also the other generations to make sure that we're not so tied into one political point of view that sort of colors the lens of everything that we read in the Bible. God's kingdom is above every other kingdom. And while we're citizens of a world kingdom here on earth, our primary citizenship is that in the kingdom of God. So what does that mean for us in our institutional church life each and every day? All right, finally, so we want to thank you for watching this presentation today. We want to remind you also that our series will continue next Sunday night. We'll post on our YouTube page and also our Facebook page. We'll talk a little bit more about Generation X, which is my generation. I'm actually kind of excited about talking about our group and what we get right and what we get wrong and how to better relate to the generation that is kind of the middle child between the baby boomers and the millennials. So we'll talk more about them next week. And then we also invite you to connect with us throughout the week at westoakwoods.com. Find us on Facebook, find us on YouTube, find us on Instagram, or you can just get in touch with us the old-fashioned way. Give us a call, send us an email, or just show up at church. We'd love to see you Sunday mornings for Bible study at 9:30. Have classes for all age groups. And also we worship at 10:45 on Sunday mornings. And also we have Bible study on Wednesday nights as well. So we hope to see you sometime soon. And if not, thank you for watching. We appreciate your support and your help for our church. We'll see you soon, everybody. Bye-bye.